This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. The challenge posed by drug cartels in Latin America continues to evolve, affecting new countries and having a huge impact on politics. Today on the podcast, an overview of what's changing in the region's fight against organized crime.
I am not saying that the solution for violence in Latin America is legalization of drugs, but I think this is a moment to really discuss how to tackle drugs as a health problem, but also as a political and social problem. Because also the capacity of the cartels or the drug groups to penetrate politics is growing exponentially.
The recent images out of Ecuador were just the latest reminder of the extraordinary power of drug cartels in Latin America. Despite valiant attempts to crack down by many governments over the years, the production of cocaine in the region continues to soar, more than doubling over the past 10 years. Smuggling routes have also changed as demand in the United States and Europe rises, but new consumers in Asia and within Latin America itself also increasingly crave the drug. Cocaine is an industry worth tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, meaning that cartels are often better financed and resourced than some governments. In today's episode, we want to take an honest look at how governments around Latin America are responding to this crisis today. And I say honest because this is a topic where, frankly, sometimes you have to get past the posturing among politicians as well as analysts in order to find out what's really happening. So today we'll ask which governments in Latin America are trying to crack down and which might be quietly seeking some kind of truce or equilibrium with organized crime groups. We'll discuss whether legalization of some drugs might be politically viable and how drug violence is likely to impact politics and business in years to come. Our guest today is a true authority on this subject. Lucía Dammert has dedicated years of research in the fields of security, criminal organizations, and criminal justice reform. She also has firsthand experience. She served during the first 6 months of the Gabriel Boric government as a top presidential advisor and has also advised governments in Argentina, Mexico, and Peru. She's currently a professor at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile. Lucía, welcome to the America's Quarterly Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Lucía, as I noted in the introduction, you are a veteran of security challenges and security policy across Latin America. When you saw these images out of Ecuador, what was your first thought?
Well, as you know, Ecuador was for a long time a success story. They even called themselves as Island of Peace. So it was really awful to see not only the levels of violence that has grown so fast in Ecuador, but also the limited capacity that political appointees and in general, the Latin American debate shows in these kind of scenarios. Because right there, you can see, people talking about armed forces, the militarization of public security, greater punishment and stuff like that, without really taking a look at what really happened in Ecuador. So I think it's a signal of the erosion of democratic values in Latin America. I think it's also a dimension of the weaknesses of the rule of law. So those are, key dimensions, not only for Ecuador, but for the whole region.
Of course, what's happening in Ecuador is not unique. The presence of drug cartels in Latin America is an old issue, but there have been some important changes in recent years. I would point to two things. The first is that the amount of cocaine being produced has grown exponentially. It has more than doubled in the last decade. That includes a substantial increase since the pandemic. And then the second change is that some of the smuggling and shipping routes have also changed, in part because of shifts in demand. Cocaine used to mostly flow north to the United States and Europe. That is still true, but there's also demand now in Asia, as well as in Latin America itself, keeping in mind that Brazil, for example, is one of the biggest global consumers of cocaine now. In your mind, has public debate in the region kind of caught up with these changing facts? Are people aware of this massive increase that I just described?
Not really. And also, I would say that there is a clear evidence of the consolidation of a lot of other illegal markets. So drugs are really important. And the cocaine trade is, as you mentioned, is increasing. Levels of consumption everywhere are, going up in Latin America. So you have, particular internal markets that were not as strong previously. But also you have, smuggling of migrants. You have illegal mining. You have illegal lodging. You have, even, illegal trade of exotic animals from the Amazon basin. So there is a lot of different, illegal markets that are growing strong in Latin America. And those analyses are missing from public policy. And that's why we always come back to, the regular, the usual suspect of increasing punishment, bringing the military, and not really realizing that illegal markets are powerful because they penetrate, state institutions.
So it's interesting that you're emphasizing this broad growth in, I guess you could say, illegality and the deterioration of, to use your phrase, the rule of law. What are the common denominators here then? What is it at the most fundamental level that is changing in your mind? Because I was one of many people who compared these scenes in Ecuador to kind of the worst of the Pablo Escobar days in Colombia in the late 80s and early 90s. Let me stop on that for a second. I mean, it's true that drug gangs control sections of rural Mexico. They control parts of urban environments in Brazil, other countries as well. But what we saw in Ecuador was an assault on central power. This was not only the dramatic images out of the TV station that ricocheted around the world, but there was kidnapping of policemen as well. I mean, really just a direct affront, a direct conflict with centralized authority in a way that maybe we hadn't seen again since the early 80s or rather the late 80s and early 90s when the Medellin cartel was blowing up commercial airlines and killing justice minister and things. So again, my question, what's changing now?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. I think it's different because nowadays you have multiplicity of small, local gangs that because of globalization are linked to regional and international and global gangs or criminal organizations. So if it is true that you have, I don't know, the Yakuza or the Russian mafia or the Italian Andretta or the Albanians in Ecuador, we don't really know. But we have some local gangs who are linked to those, So the first thing to mention is that we went to a really huge, corporate type of governance of criminality into a more boutique type of governance of criminality in Latin America, in most countries. So now it's very difficult to organize their actions. So I'm not sure if what happened in the TV station is something that was ordered by whomever or was a loose end of those local organizations that decided to do it. And the second thing, I'm not surprised of what happened in the prison system. We have had problems like that in Brazil previously, in many other countries. The prison system has been forgotten by Latin American governments for a decade. In most countries, prison systems are being run by prisoners. And what we had mostly is a state or a government that is, in fact, preoccupied of two things. One, that they don't kill each other within, the premises of the jail. And second, that they are not, escaping the jail. But besides that, everything that happens within the prison system is, in most cases, out of control of the state. So if you have that situation running for a decade, of course, you cannot start your government or start your decision making by cutting that equilibrium, because that was a precarious equilibrium between the state and criminal organizations at the jail system. So if you start saying, okay, we are going to move everyone from one place to the other, we had that in Mexico before and in Brazil and many other countries. So I think we as academic, as a public people, as an intellectuals, but also as politicians, we have to take into account that the jail system is pretty much, a medular part of the rule of law. It's not something that we can just forget about it because then, the tsunami comes back and tsunami is very violent.
I was interested in your use of the word equilibrium, which I want to come back to. Some of the reporting that has come out of Ecuador, including by the New York Times, suggests that it was a disturbance in that equilibrium that may have compelled the gangs to lash out, specifically an operation by the Attorney General of Ecuador, Diana Salazar, to move some of these gang leaders around and stop them from ordering crimes from the inside, which, as you point out, the situation we've seen in prisons all over the region. Now, President Daniel Noboa, who is new to the job, he has responded, or seems to have responded so far, in, I suppose, the traditional way. He has vowed to take this issue seriously. He's declared an internal armed conflict and is using the armed forces to regain control of the rule of law. You think it'll work?
Well, in the short term, in the short run, perhaps it would work. But as we have seen in El Salvador 2012, we have seen this in Guatemala before, we've seen this in Honduras, in many other countries in Latin America, this type of measure requires a lot of other structural measures that are not linked to the practices of criminals, that are mostly linked to the practices of state institutions. Because if you need to really reinforce your crime control policies. You need to have a better police officers. You have to cut political corruption in terms of, electoral campaign financing. So what is interesting is that we are perceiving the problem of Ecuador as a problem of a sectoral problem of the state, this is a specific problem of security. And my perception is that what is happening in Ecuador and in other countries is really an image of the whole crisis of the state development. If we want to fight these markets, really fight the markets, because this is a different thing to fight the violence the markets produce.
That search of an equilibrium, a coexistence with illegality, seems to be where a lot of governments in the region are right now. I think of the López Obrador government in Mexico, which has, I think it's safe to say, avoided a strategy of direct confrontation for the most part with the cartels. As a result, the homicide rate has come down a bit in the last few years, but the spread of extortion and kidnapping and the entry of drug money into local politics is mind-blowing, according to analysts there on the ground. The other approach, the other extreme, and when you mentioned El Salvador a moment ago, I thought you were going to talk about Nayib Bukele, but that's also not really viable in most countries around the region. I think you'd agree. I mean, can you explain why a Bukele strategy is unlikely in a place like Ecuador or a place like Chile?
Sure. But just let me say that this equilibrium is not only a Latin American, dimension. This is everywhere. I mean, what happened in the US that actually consumed 90% of the whole cocaine being produced in Latin America? Why don't you have so many, homicides? Why there is no fighting for the market? Because there is an equilibrium in the market.
That's right.
It's not that, no one is actually buying stuff. They are buying stuff. Or what is happening with the illegal gold that moves from Peru and Colombia into Europe? I don't know, but my perception is that you also have a different equilibrium over there that allows that gold to get, legal in a very, complex way. But coming back to your idea of your question on Bukele, well, my sense is that the President Bukele saw that politicians have not been really either successful or serious in terms of the policies that have to be taken into account. So what he did is say, well, everything that has been done in El Salvador is really not working because they were not really well implemented in most places. So we are going to go, tough hand, the iron fist, mano dura. And that is working. Yes, it is working because he's putting in jail everyone. 2% of the adult population is in jail, most of them not after a regular judicial process, but he has regained peace in many neighborhoods. And that's something that is undeniable. And also, he has changed some of the illnesses of the state work in this area. So you can see, police officers on the street, you can see many things. Is that worth it? I mean, the level of human rights violations that are, arising nowadays, the discussions on the so-called conversations between the president and specific Mara leaders that are being presented by some experts and colleagues over there in Salvador.
Salvadorans, at least for the moment, seem to think so. But leaving El Salvador for just a second, because I don't want to get hung up on that one case, you're in Chile, in which we haven't really spoken about yet. There has been an increase, a scary increase in homicides in recent years, not on a par with Ecuador, but poll after poll shows that Chileans find this to be the most important issue facing the country. You were part of a government, the Gabriel Boric government, which attempted to take this problem seriously. Do you think that if the Boric government can't get its hands around this problem in the next 2 years, could there be appetite in Chile for a leader like Bukele?
For sure. I mean, last week, a poll showed that 55% of Chileans think that something similar to Ecuador could happen here in Chile. That's huge because our homicide rate, has grown, but still is 6.7.
Which, for context, is roughly comparable to the national average in the United States and well below most U.S. cities.
Well below. And in those places that we have, really high levels of homicide, the rate is 17, which is, it could be portrayed as a success story in Colombia. But Chile has been champion on fear of crime because of the expectations of the people, because this was a very safe country. And there is a narrative, this is not new narrative, but there is a narrative in the last perhaps 10 to 15 years that, increases the perception that migrants are the ones bringing insecurity, that the presence of criminal organization, international criminal organization is, key to those processes. So it's very difficult to talk about structural changes here in Chile. And my sense is that, unfortunately, the government has not been able to tackle the problems that the jail system has. And in fact, the number of people in jail has grown steadily, even faster during the President Boric government than before. And that will bring very bad news because we all know that jails now are universities of crime. The whole narrative of punishment, the whole punitive populism is very much, entrenched in the Chilean political conversation. So we will have our, I don't know if a Bukele type, but we will have our share of, politics and conversations based on no evidence, but on perceptions, unfortunately.
I wonder sometimes if governments and citizens in the region are up against a wall of money, the resources that are produced by the world's demand for cocaine. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars for organized crime groups. And in some cases, that dwarfs the resources that governments have. In this conversation, I have found myself thinking, I mean, are governments really just forced to choose what kinds of problems they want to have? Do you want to fight the cartels, as the Calderon government did in Mexico in the late 2000s, as some Colombian governments have over the years, with mixed results, sometimes bringing homicide rates down, but rarely, if ever, stopping the smuggling or the production of cocaine itself? Or, again, do you reach for this kind of equilibrium or coexistence with these gangs, like we see the current Mexican government, the López Obrador government, trying to do? I think you see this in pockets of Brazil as well. Let me talk about Sao Paulo for a moment. Sao Paulo is a state that has one of the lowest homicide rates in all of Latin America. It's about 8 per 100,000. That's about the U.S. national average for comparison. But they've had that, and it's partly the result of a monoculture, if you will, or one very organized criminal group, the PCC, the Primeiro Comando da Capital, having hegemony over that area. And so there's very few homicides. They've reached an equilibrium with the officials there in that state who, for the most part, leave them alone. But just like in the Mexican case, it's produced other problems: cargo theft, extortion, the amount of money that flows into politics. So I guess, Lucia, my question is, are governments just forcing to choose between different kinds of problems, or is there a third way between these two paths of compromise and the classic war on drugs?
Well, we have to start discussing new regulation of the drug market. I mean, there is no way that we will continue doing the same stuff and getting different results.
You're referring to decriminalization or legalization in the consumer countries, I assume.
I think so. I think the government, Latin American governments have to start discussing this very difficult issue because, as mentioned before, we have been in this war, and this is a war that we are losing. So I am not saying that the solution for violence in Latin America is legalization of drugs, but I think this is a moment to really discuss how to tackle drugs as a health problem, but also as a political and social problem. Because also the capacity of the cartels or the drug groups to penetrate politics is growing exponentially. I mean, what are we waiting for in order to have these very difficult conversations? I know that former President Lagos, Samper, and others presented this topic where many years ago, when even Fernando Enrique Cardoso, when they were former presidents. Now we need the presidents to discuss these issues.
It is interesting to me and illustrative that it is only former presidents, for the most part, who are willing to discuss this issue openly. An exception has been President Petro in Colombia, who, on the one hand, has spoken in support of legalization and has called for other countries in the region to go down that path, but has not really moved in that direction. And there's reasons for that. But look, I mean, you were part of a government on the left, a generational change that could not be accused of, being inclined to do things the old way, that has, if anything, gone in the opposite direction. I mean, it's a government that seems to be trying to address this violence through conventional means. Why, in your mind? I mean, these are sovereign governments in the region, many of which continue to fight the quote unquote war on drugs in the old way rather than having this debate. From the perspective of somebody who was on the inside for a while, why is that?
My sense is that never in Latin America, never, not even during the Kirchner's or the Lula or, even Chavez, we have had more progressive policy on crime control and crime prevention. Never. There has always been an incapability of the progressive part of the political realm to discuss these issues because public perception is tougher on the ideas of crime because the public needs immediate results, and the perception is that progressive or left-wing governments are presenting something that is structural, so nothing is going to change. And it has been very difficult for left-wing governments to change that narrative. On the other hand, what has happened is that those countries are the ones who are, becoming tougher and tougher. You can see, President Lula now bringing the military to police or crime control issues. Here in Chile, we have also the armed forces on the border patrol. So, you have many elements of that. My sense is that that narrative works for the electoral debates, but at the end of the day, doesn't work for public policy, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. My sense is looking at polls around the region. I mean, societies in many cases are becoming more conservative on a variety of issues. And I have not seen polling in Chile, for example, but I've seen polling in Brazil showing overwhelming majorities against legalization, even of marijuana.
Yeah. Well, here we have we have different perceptions, but of course, I mean, if you are going to decriminalize or legalize marijuana consumption or any other drug, you have to start by investing on, health programs. You have to start investing on educational programs. And that's why I'm saying that security is not only a security problem, it's a statewide problem because of course, if you are part of the majority of Latin Americans who lived in very marginalized, crowded, with little presence of the state, and the state that they see is a corrupt state, of course you will require mano dura. Of course, because besides that, there is oblivion, there is nothing. So, in order to move forward in the real debate on the drug problem, you also have to redefine the state presence. You have to redefine the state strategy to deal with millions of people from Latin America and other countries who are actually consuming, drugs all the time. If you don't, put that dimension into the mix of analysis, then you just, keep on talking about more police forces and the military and, how drones are going to change everything or, body worn cameras. And, this is a market. If we don't start thinking of the cocaine problem in Latin America and the violent problem in Latin America as a market problem, then of course the response is limited because we are just, perceiving and attacking the more feeble part of the chain.
My final question for you, Lucia, leaving aside what we think should happen, as we look at the region as a whole, not just Ecuador, but kind of a broad brush, where do you think in practice this issue of combating drug cartels, of trying to reduce violence, where do you think it's actually going to lead us in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think if we continue to have, economic crisis, you will see more and more violent situations throughout Latin America. I think there is an importance of the economic cycle for sure, because for many Latin American kids, the only way to move forward or to survive is to be part of the illegal market, So I am not really optimistic in terms of violence and criminality in the next years. Also, the deterioration of the quality of political parties. I think this is an element that will play a big role in terms of the the participation on the or the penetration of criminal actors into more political debates. And this is something that is already happening throughout Latin America. Hopefully, what happened yesterday in Guatemala will open the eyes of many governments to see that if we get together and we really work together to some specific topics, things change. I mean, if just in Guatemala, if there were not a strong presence of presidents and foreign affairs ministers and Europeans and the US and so on and so forth, perhaps Arevalo will not be president today. So that's a signal that when we get together with good policies, sound policies that have people in the center instead of people in the target zone, we can, be better.
On that relatively optimistic note, Lucía, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.